Good afternoon, everyone. Just to give you a quick recap, for those that might be new to this series, we started out these webinars with the big picture shift, moved to ships within content and practices, and now we're covering special topics. Can you move forward, please? Okay. We've got a really big show for you tonight. Sorry, that sounds funny, but a lot of presenters. So I'm Michelle McCarthy, and as we go through the sections, people will just introduce themselves as we're going. I'm the Science Instructional Coordinator. You go to the next slide. Okay, so just some housekeeping. Good. Oh, sorry. So engagement is where we want you to interact with us. And when we ask to post in the chat, do that or any other active, inactive pieces. And please just take care of yourself. If you need to step away for anything, you can go ahead and do that. We'd really like you to keep your camera on. If for some reason you can't, please just message one of the people that are on the line that are with the Office of Public Instruction. And then the resources are linked, the Google Drive, and then this session is session 7, and it has all the materials. You were also emailed those, and we'll refer to those here, and the slide deck was in there also. So let me just go forward. Okay, our responsibility is to meet the ARM 1055-714 and 257-216. And those, I think the links are being put in the chat. If you want a professional development unit certificate for this course, we need you to check in when that's time, to keep your camera on, to participate, reflect, and hopefully make connections. So, and complete the evaluation survey at the end. Okay. Thank you. By the end of this sessions, hopefully you will learn approaches that help it differentiate with meeting students' needs, identify critical practices for English language learners, and understand the importance of need for cultural relevance, sorry, it's the end of the day, for student learning. So real quick, let's give a check in the chat. What's working? What's wobbly? So is anyone willing to share with their mic off, on? Unmute yourself if you want to share that way, or you can post something in the chat. So if you just share what's going well, what barriers are you running into? I'm trying to make my chat bigger. Okay. Can you see what's in the chat, Claire? Or is your
Nothing so far.
nothing so far?
We can probably move ahead to our
Okay.
check-in. Oh,
Okay.
we've got one.
Oh, okay.
Algebra 1 standards.
Thanks. So those are wobbly or doing well? Maybe you'll share later. Okay, so your check-in is please drop in the chat your name and respond to, as we move forward, how do we ensure that every student receives meaningful math learning? Ah, see it. Okay. Too many standards. Okay. I can just see Karen's and Rachel's. those scenarios. I think that is harder, the real world scenarios, and I think in all the disciplines. Well, maybe not ELA, but yeah. So thank you. You can go ahead and keep doing posting if you haven't got an opportunity yet. So can you go to slide forward there? Thank you. So this first section is on differentiation. Well, it's on meeting all the students' needs. So here's a list of everything that we deal with. You guys are all familiar with this. So a couple of things I want you to think about through these next couple of slides is how do we teach or reach all these students? And if student labels affect educators' expectations. Can you go forward, please? Okay, so the content standard specialist, Claire, Katrina, and myself, we did a book study on let's see, your students, my student, our students. I think I got it mixed up. I think it was my first, but it was about reaching all students, and it was written by, well, it was written by 5 authors, but 2 of them were Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the big names in education. Well, we called them and well, we wrote them and asked if they'd be willing to appear on our podcast, and they agreed, which we were really thought that that was wonderful. So what I have is their transcript from the podcast. And I think the links to the podcast is in there. And also there's a link to their transcript. So so please, I would like you to check and make sure that you can reach the transcript. I just want to make sure everybody can get in there. It was a long session and it's a lot of writing, but we're going to try text rendering. It's been color coded for different conceptual ideas and then bolded phrases. So if you just want to skim through and kind of think of things that you would be interested in reading, and then maybe you can read that section. Can you go forward one, please? Okay, there's a QR code to also get it if you didn't get to it through the link. So also think of what was meaningful for you, and then we're going to do a reflection when we're done. So you can highlight or mark sentences or phrases or individual words that you feel is meaningful for you or you can identify within your classroom. I think there's one more slide on this. Nope. All right. So I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes because this is kind of, please write in the chat if for some reason you are unable to get to that transcript. Sounded like aliens were here, Karen.
We just got some new participants. To those of you who joined, we're looking over this podcast transcript, and there's a lot, so it's color coded. Pick a color or two to peruse, and then you're reflecting on scenarios that apply to you and what is meaningful, picking out a sentence or phrase from the pod or from the transcript.
It is really big. I just had a hard time deciding. I couldn't take anything out. I didn't have the nerve. Claire, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, and then for those that do get done, they can go to the uh, Padlet. We've got a bunch of people in the Padlet.
Can you see it on the screen now, Michelle?
Not the Padlet, no.
Okay, I know how to fix it. Now, can you?
Yes.
Okay, good.
The ones that I put on as I love that phrase, collective effervescence.
Yeah.
That was pretty. Oh, somebody else just put Matt did. Yep. Define success. It's personalized for everybody.
Individual progress rather than comparing child A with child B, someone said. Yeah, this is a great point. being able to access curriculum is important for all kids, including the kids with paperwork.
Believe in the impossible. I like that. Yeah, they were in the podcast, they were actually kind of funny. I hope you guys get an opportunity to watch it. Because when they were talking about um the research on how students improve when they're in the classroom, they said, isn't that kind of funny? You know, they learn to read because they have access to teachers that are teaching them to read.
Someone pointed out that the label can change expectations.
Yes.
So the systems are important.
Okay, I think we can.
Back to the slide. I love seeing everyone's mouse
Yeah.
moving around.
Yeah, I wish everybody named
Success is
stuff. I
personal.
don't know how to fix that. I guess you have to invite. Well, thank you guys for participating in that. Um, so the next part of this, we're just transitioning. So that was about all students, every kind of student. And then this next part, we're going to dive down deeper to specific helpful hints in specific areas.
Yes. So this section was created by our English language specialist, Serena Wright, who has since left us, sadly. But I am sharing what she has here, and we have some resources. So hopefully this gives you guys a great place to start with our English learners and supporting them in the math classroom. So we're going to look at some strategies for making math accessible and equitable for every student. So we'll start by asking, why does language matter in math? And we know math is a language-rich subject, so students need to understand terms and explain their thinking. And for ELLs, this can be kind of a double challenge because they're learning the language of English and they're also learning the language of math. So oral language becomes super important, and along with that, collaboration, because we all learn a lot by talking to each other and listening. So group work can be really helpful for our English language learners. Students can hear strategies and vocabulary from their classmates. They can discuss ideas. Time is really important, giving students the time to formulate and ask clarifying questions and really reflect on their thinking before they're kind of asked to share in that language that might be secondary to them. And that's going to help them build confidence as well. So an example of one of these collaboration techniques might just be something short like a think, pair, share. So you're giving students a problem, giving them time to think and discuss in pairs, and then maybe share using a sentence frame. And we'll talk a little bit more. There's a slide on sentence frames that kind of goes over different categories that you might use in a math classroom. But they're basically like a structure where students can fill in the blanks, but you're giving them some of that language to kind of reduce that cognitive load. You can also, when you're collaborating, think about different grouping strategies. So you might mix language pairs or have language buddies. So if two students both speak Spanish, they can speak in their heritage language before sharing out in English. Or you might have groups with different roles. So someone is explaining the problem, someone is taking notes, and then someone else is double checking the work. So some language scaffolds, just different types you might use. We have sentence frames, which again, I'll talk about. Here are some fairly general categories. There are going to be a little bit more detailed ones, but you can make these more specific and pointed for activities like intros to class or exit tickets where you want them to focus on a specific concept or formatively assess their learning. Then we have visual supports. So those are things like anchor charts, where you might have key vocab, strategies, different concepts that you can create with students throughout the year. Graphic organizers, and then another example of a visual is a manipulative, like a fraction bar or a tangram. And as I was reviewing these, I was like, what is a math manipulative? Because I am an EL or an English person. So I wanted to give you all an opportunity to collaboratively learn from each other. So as I keep kind of going over this slide, if you have a favorite manipulative, would you please share what that is in the chat along with your grade level, just so we can all see what some of these manipulatives are, and I can learn from you as well. As you're sharing your manipulatives, I'll continue. We can have word walls, so that can be vocabulary. They might be accompanied by pictures, definitions, and then native language cognates. So in a resource that I'll share and that Michelle will drop in the link a little bit later, there's a resource for identifying some of the most common cognates in Spanish and English. So those are words that are going to have a shared etymology and also a shared sound and meaning. And then we also have gallery walks and drawings as some examples of giving students ways to respond flexibly. Let's see. Counting bears. People are sharing some manipulatives. Dice cards. I read about algebra tiles. That was one that I didn't include because I couldn't picture what that was, but thank you for sharing that, because I'm sure you guys resonate with that more than I did. So responding in heritage languages, we should look at students' primary languages as a strength rather than something that is a barrier. So being given that time, like I said, to think in their heritage language can allow them to process things more fully before they are translating that into English. So you might, just as a routine, let students discuss for a few minutes with that shared language buddy. That's where that grouping might come in. And then differentiation across grade bands. A lot of these are relevant to different grade levels with just adapting them, but there's going to be some approaches that are a little more developmentally appropriate for certain grades. So for K2 or K1, you can focus on just those short oral responses using sentence frames. 2 through 3, that might become more collaborative with partners, and you might have more labeled diagrams. Grades 4 through 5, those partners might progress to triads or smaller groups with individual roles. And then you can also introduce bilingual glossaries. For 6 through 8 and 9 through 12, you can focus on integrating more discussion protocols. So that might be maybe making think pair shares a little bit more complex or varied, or utilizing Socratic seminars. And then also at that level, introducing graphic organizers as the math becomes sort of more complex and multi-stepped. So ways to balance language, math, and student voice so that every student is engaging. I've talked about some of these on previous slides, so I'll cover the ones that are a little bit newer here. That number one specifically, complex word problems can be really a great thing to use those think alouds on, especially for, or not especially for all our students, but also for our older students that we don't always think about doing think alouds for. So really going through the process of what it looks like in your mind as you're approaching those. So they are learning how to pick out those math concepts and not kind of getting bogged down in just the language. Um, Real life contexts to make math concepts concrete. I thought of Katrina's IFA items for that as well, because she has a lot of those great resources that she is using as examples with those math standards. Building in flexibility, we've talked about oral responses and drawings. Acting out responses or written explanations in English or another heritage language might be two more options for that flexibility. And then we always want to stress that growth mindset for students. So mistakes are learning opportunities. And then, of course, treating students' home languages as an asset. So some digital supports and resources that we wanted to share with you. Magic School AI. This will let you translate materials. There's also some additional translation resources in this beginner's guide to teaching English learners. But this Magic School AI will also let you create leveled texts. So for students that maybe need some access to the language, but you don't want to baby down the concepts and keep it relevant to them, that can be a great tool for leveling texts. Snorkel is a similar AI tool. It can be used a little bit more for practice and progress monitoring. And then incorporating videos or multimedia are great ways to get students that content in multimodal ways. So they're hearing it and reading it and seeing it. And then this is a resource, this beginner's guide has a ton of links. It's not math specific, but it has a lot of instructional ideas and also some family and community engagement resources. So that's a really great place to start if you have ELs and you haven't taught ELs before and you don't know where to start. I would really recommend that PDF. And then, of course, our team, Michelle and I, worked on developing the guidance for the K-12 English language proficiency standards, and those are for every content area as well. And that gives you some resources to start with as well, although it's longer. This one's a great, like, short and sweet, lots of resources. And then finally, here are some sentence frames that are a little bit more specific to what you might be focusing on instructionally in math. So you can peruse these categories, use these as examples for additional sentence frames that you might use. But you can see it provides a lot of the language and then students can kind of fill in the rest. And it also helps them learn academic language. So all of these strategies are not just for our EL students, but they're also going to help any student access the standards and practice that academic language. So your check-in for this section, how might you connect those mathematical practices to supporting language development? And those are shown there on the right. So take a minute, you can come off mute or enter in the chat. What role do you see these mathematical practices playing in supporting language development and access? Or I'm still practicing my teacher wait time, but thanks, Tammy. You might also think of it as which do you see as maybe emphasizing the importance of language development and access. Model with mathematics. Yeah, those are great ones. Even that's what I thought initially, collaborate. A lot of you making the connection to the manipulatives and modeling with mathematics. Yeah, Holly, similar idea there. All right, I want to give the TSAR team plenty of time. But keep sharing those if you haven't yet. Varied ways to express, culturally connect. Yeah, for sure. And I think Matt is also going to touch on some ways that we can focus on access for our EL students who are Indigenous students. So thank you all for sharing. And I will pass it on to the TSAR team. I'm not sure who's starting first, but you guys can introduce yourselves as you go.
Yani Washday Midagi Abi. My name's Matt Bell. I'm the Language and Culture Specialist here at the Tribal Student Achievement and Relations Unit. I have the honor and privilege of networking with tribal educators across the state and helping them spread their good resources to any teacher who's interested and any student who's interested. And yeah, we are kind of the softer side of implementing a lot of these great resources into schools and communities. So I'll let the rest of my team introduce themselves.
Crystal, do you want to go next?
I do. Thank you. Shoraja, Basalabajay Gallery, Shokbi, Absalagak, Itchikbi, Diwagam. Greetings. My name is Crystal Hickman. My crow name is Watches the Buffalo Go By, and I am stepping back today and letting my teammates take lead as I am very ill, but I'm here to support. And of course, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those or to be available to reach out to. Thank you.
Peve Shiv, my name is Michelle Hinson, and I also work as a Tribal Student Achievement Specialist at the OPI, and we can jump in, and thanks for having us today. And so we wanted to start with this concept of worldview and inference. And if worldview is a different, maybe a new concept, I know we're talking to those who work primarily in math. So if this is a new concept for you, we included a definition. And so a worldview is a comprehensive framework of ideas and beliefs through which an individual, group, or culture interprets the world and interacts with it. And so as you can see on that diagram, thinking about worldview and inference, your worldview really starts in that pool of observable data and influences every step of that ladder. And so it encompasses a system of values, attitudes, and concepts about the nature of reality itself, the self, society, and the universe. And it significantly impacts learning by acting as a lens through which learners interpret information, sets goals, and approaches problems, because it greatly influences the way students or any learner, any person interprets literature and spoken language. You can go to the next slide. And so in addition to thinking about language, we also want to introduce this concept of worldview and mindset. And so this slide shows some of the differences that you might see in a Western versus a tribal mindset. And as you look at this, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that no single person lies on, specifically on one side or the other. And also, this isn't a, kind of it's mostly designed to show you some of the differences, not necessarily say that, one is better than the other, just that there's a difference. And so, um, there's a lot that could be teased out here, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but we would love to talk with you more. If this is of any interest or anything that we present today is of any interest. But one thing we want to draw attention to is thinking about, we're talking a lot about communication today. And so thinking about from that Western mindset, there's a heavy emphasis on verbal communication, whereas with tribal mindset, there might be a heavier emphasis on nonverbal communication, and just recognizing that that is a difference that occurs. And then the other big one, even though they're all important and all relevant to this conversation, also want to draw attention to this idea of like individual versus collective. And so on that Western side, the bottom line there, you see sort of this emphasis on getting an A or that sort of individual achievement versus on the tribal mindset, there may be more of an emphasis on developing your personal gifts or purpose from more of that collective lens, like thinking about what is your role, what is your purpose for yourself, but then also as you contribute to the happenings around you because you're intricately connected to those around you. And you can move forward. And we wanted to bring this into this conversation because we know that Indigenous worldview persists today. We know that a student's worldview in relation to their language, but also, outside of language, that their worldview will greatly influence learning and academic engagement. And we also know that an Indigenous worldview does not always align with Western education models. And so where somebody lies on that spectrum might really influence the way they are interacting with school, their perception of school, and just their everyday, top to bottom, the way they experience school and the way they participate in school. But one thing we do not know is of how many of Montana's tribal students continue to practice and may influenced by Indigenous worldview, or to what degree. So there's really no way to measure what we just described. So we know that it's important to learning. We know that many students possess that tribal worldview, but measuring that is a bit difficult because there's really no way to measure the way somebody perceives the world around them. And you can go to the next slide. But one thing that we also know is that language is often one way worldview is expressed and understood. And so even though we know there are going to be students who possess that tribal worldview but don't necessarily speak their Indigenous language, we know that speaking an Indigenous language is usually a pretty good measure of the worldview that a student possesses. And so using things like English language learner and language of impact data can kind of serve as a proxy measure for this, but we want to just recognize that it is vastly going to be underrepresenting a large proportion of students who still possess that worldview, but don't necessarily, speak, they're not necessarily fluent in their Indigenous language, or maybe don't meet that definition of an English language learner. But nonetheless, we have some ELL data we want to use to kind of give you some sort of a picture of what this could look like in the state of Montana. And those are my kids in those slides that we just showed. They're much older now, but that's my oldest, and the previous slide was my youngest. And so here's just some data on English language learner students who are also tribal. And so for the past decade, tribal students make up between 10 and 11% of the student population of Montana, but they make up over half of Montana's ELL students, and in some years, well over half. So in some years, we're at about 58% of Montana's English language learner students are tribal students or Indigenous students. And so statewide, between 13 and 15% of Montana's tribal students are English language learner students. And you can go to the next slide. So again, thinking about language and how worldview is expressed and understood, we know that when lessons are delivered in the English language, they're delivered in European, they're being delivered in a worldview that's rooted in your European worldview. And so if there's one, I think maybe one takeaway from this, I think realize that not only is language important, but worldview is also important when it comes to working with all learners. And if you are delivering a lesson in English, not only is there that language translation that may be needing to occur, but there's also going to be maybe some worldview interpretation that your students are going to be going through as well. And so one of those points that we want to make on this slide is that, English language acquisition is also European worldview acquisition. And so English language learners are often also European cultural learners, and that students that possess a tribal worldview are often asked or required to also sort of layer learning European worldview on top of some of these other learning requirements. And so that's a big topic to kind of introduce in a small amount of time, but hopefully kind of just introduce that to you in this moment as we move into kind of showing some data. And so we wanted to start with that because we feel like this, there's a lot that contributes to academic achievement. There's a lot that contributes to this data that we're showing you now, but we feel like language and worldview are really important things to consider as we look at some of this data that we've been tracking as far as student academic achievement goes. And so this data shows math proficiency rates for grades 3 through 8 from 2016 to 2024. And one thing that we think is interesting is so that orange line that you see, that's representing Native students off reservation. And then that red line is, the orange line is non-Native students off reservation, and the red line is non-Native students on reservation. And then you see that lighter blue line, that's showing Native students off reservation, and then the blue line is Native students on reservation. And I know that's a lot, but if you want to click through these next couple slides, so that's math grades 3 through 8. Here's high school math proficiency. You see a similar trend. And here's ELA proficiency for grades 3 through 8. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can. And so here's ELA proficiency for high school. And so I know there's a lot of data we move through quickly, but there's the trend here is that orange line, those non-Native students off reservation are consistently performing at the greatest academic achievement level, closely followed by non-Native students on reservation. And so regardless of where students are attending school, non-Native students are doing fairly well, fairly comparable to each other, especially you can see with those younger grades, in grades 3 through 8, that orange line and that red line are fairly similar. And then regardless of where students are attending school, our Native students, there's some barriers. There's something happening regardless on if they're attending school on reservation or off reservation that's keeping them from achieving at rates comparable to their non-Native peers. And we know there's a lot that contributes to this. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of other contributing factors. But the one thing we wanted to present today is, the influence of language, the influence of worldview, and the potential relationship with driving some of these achievement data scores that we see. And so if you want to keep moving forward, and thank you for scrolling through. And so our takeaway for you all today is just to be aware of these extra layers of learning requirements that tribal students, especially tribal English language learner students, may possess. And so again, thinking about that slide that has the Western and tribal mindset, we know that people can fall anywhere along that spectrum. But for those students who fall on that, fall heavily on that tribal mindset side, there's these extra layers of learning requirements for them. And so one really simple way to support them is to provide more time for responding. So not only is there perhaps language interpretation that's happening, there may also be that worldview, deciphering between worldviews and having to go through that process of taking a curriculum that's being delivered to them in English and just having those extra requirements to translate that for themselves into a worldview that they understand. Also, I think, understand that a lack of response does not mean lack of engagement or interest. Again, there might just be some extra things happening for these students that just extra requirements for them that require extra time and extra work that may come across as a lack of engagement. Making efforts to make learning opportunities that incorporate or are rooted in Indigenous worldview and experience can be really helpful so that it cuts down on that need for interpretation between worldview. And then also just making sure that the learning space is a place that lends itself to being a really comfortable place for Indigenous students, because again, just helps with if they're feeling safe and they're feeling like they're in a place that they belong, and I saw that in the chat a couple times, that again is allowing that cognitive space to not be worried about, not be scanning for threats or not being in a place where they're wondering if they're, safe and supportive. It can concentrate more on the academic pieces that are being asked for them to perform. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt. And I apologize as I turn it over to Matt. I also have to run to go pick up my daughter. But thank you for having me here. And I really appreciate the time and thank you very much. And reach out anytime if we can be helpful.
Thanks, Michelle. To kind of build on that idea of wait time, I would say by and large in Indigenous culture, it's kind of a value to give something a lot of thought before you weigh in and give your opinion on things. And so, in practical terms, sometimes if we're the one or two native students in class, sometimes it's hard for us to follow that culture of shooting your hand up whenever you get the answer or something like that. And again, that sometimes seems like lack of engagement, but it's almost adhering to more of a cultural value. And so I guess kind of building on some of these ideas, I see a lot of you are elementary teachers in the chat, and that's wonderful. I think developing relationships with your students kind of comes naturally. For higher level grades, it's a little more difficult, but we do encourage it to have those students feel comfortable in their setting. We encourage kind of getting to know students, having them get to know you in various ways. Open yourself up as someone who's kind of capable of making fallible decisions. Um, but kind of touching on the language piece, there might be some kind of misconception sometimes regarding language of impact with a large number of these native students who are qualifying as Title III. Um, it's not necessarily that their families are practicing a form of fluent heritage language, rather, because of the boarding school policies and other historical events, the language of impact is more likely a non-standard dialect of English. If you kind of think about us all watching the Super Bowl a couple weeks ago, and I ask you who did the quarterback throw the ball to, that's recognizable, but on a standardized test, we'd all be marked wrong for saying that question like that. And yeah, so in some communities, dialects are just kind of have a different aspect to them, and that's where some of our students come from. And keying into that, learning about where they come from, not just if it's a reservation community, but where particularly in that community, because they all have unique aspects to some little neighborhoods and towns and stuff. And if you could kind of if you're from outside of Montana, if you could kind of picture someone making reference to your hometown or a place you're familiar with, that might excite your knowledge base quicker than bringing in unfamiliar places and concepts to activate a math problem. So getting to know your students, getting to know their language background, is very, very helpful if you want to go to the next slide. Um, and if you're thinking about including Indian education for all, or other background knowledge, maybe kind of think about where that's being placed in your curriculum. Hopefully, it's not just in November for Indian Heritage Month. We do experience nationwide a kind of bias by omission in that a lot of things and concepts aren't really discussed or brought forward in classrooms. So being intentional with, having things throughout the year, and then also thinking about how whether these things are primarily before the 1900s or after, because we do encourage people to, kind of keep a balance of history and contemporary understandings and heroes and people that can contribute to better understanding. So these are some of the things we kind of think about at the Tribal Student Achievement and Relations Unit and can kind of come share with your educators, your staff. Um, I guess my putting my teacher hat on, one of my favorite activities for language learners was sentence combining activity. Historically, our heritage languages were kind of succinct in their phrases. So if you can kind of help students along with multi-phrasal sentences by helping them use and or because or but and combine two phrases together, you'll get a little bit more dynamic response that way. So yeah, just a few tips, ideas. Maybe I'll pass it back to Michelle or Claire to close us out for the last few minutes. Thanks for letting me join.
Thanks so much, Matt. I feel like every time the TSAR team presents, I have my mind blown in some way that should have been obvious to me before, but is a great reminder. And this time it was the reminder too that wait time is not just for language, but also for like the ways that our cultures influence how we perceive the things that we're learning. So great resources from the TSAR team, which I will drop in the chat really quick, their contact information. And I also wanted to share that this team has a really great podcast if you want to learn more about their work that is also incredibly thoughtful. Sorry, I'm sharing the wrong link. Michelle, would you mind sharing the TSAR website link while I close us out? And we'll share their contact information here as well. But from these different kind of approaches to accessibility that we've covered today, take a minute in the chat, or you can come off mute and identify one strategy, or maybe it's something that you were like, oh, aha, that should have been obvious to me, but thank you so much for the reminder. One thing from today's session that could help you increase access to math learning for your students.
One last thing I'll drop in terms of tips for language and culture inclusion. I find a lot of crossover with art, especially, just representations that you can put on the wall. Um, if you can kind of dig into some of the geometric art that's more predominantly like Lakota, Dakota, plains, and then juxtapose it with some of the more floral art that's maybe Salish, you can kind of get to some of those essential understandings that help present tribes as unique and diverse, but also demonstrate some of those geometry math principles with their shapes and colors. Just a thought.
Thanks, Matt. Wait time is always a great reminder for kids and us as adults. Math vocabulary, more time for cultural reasoning, thinking, considering language and worldview, wait time. Thank you all. I'm gonna
For
keep
all of
moving, but
those who are responding wait time, Crystal Hickman has a wonderful approach to presenting circles, talking circles, and the beauty of that is it allows a person to share if they want, and it doesn't require that everyone answer at the same time. It gives the option of wait time built in, so it's one helpful tool as well.
yeah, that is a great one too. All right, so their contact information, that was the TSAR team you just heard from. Like I said, we don't currently have an English language learning specialist, but Marissa Britton Bostwick is our current contact for that if you have questions or are looking for additional resources. And Jenny Jarvis is our SPED contact who would have the most knowledge of math. But the SPED team is, their contact information and website is available here as well. And these are in your handouts as well, if Michelle doesn't have time to copy paste all those links. So looking ahead, our next session is on IFA and cultural relevance, and Katrina will be back with her math expertise for all of you math teachers and presenting with JC Jeffers from our IFA team. We have our grade 1 expanded guidance document and kindergarten available. The grade 2 is in the works. If you don't subscribe to the Math Minute, that is Katrina's math updates. There is the QR code for February and the subscription. If you would like to do that, I can go back, but I want to get you the feedback form since it's 5 o'clock. And thank you all so much for spending this time with us. We know you're very busy, and we appreciate you taking the time to learn with us. And a special thank you to our TSAR presenters as well. Ooh, Michelle did get all of those links. Good job.
I tested before the meeting if I could just scoop up a whole bunch and I'll let
I was
you.
wondering. I always do them one at a time and I feel rushed. Thank you all for joining. We can stick around if you have questions.